Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 55. We live in an age where information is everywhere, limitless, immediate, and free. But instead of empowering us, this abundance has created an overwhelming flood of misinformation and deliberate disinformation. These forces don't just cloud our understanding, they exploit our psychology, fueling mistrust in science, expertise, and institutions. The stakes couldn't be higher. Our health, democracy, and collective future all depend on navigating this minefield of modern communication. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're exploring this complex landscape, how to make sense of it, rebuild trust, and equip ourselves with the tools to think critically in an era of information chaos. Our guest today is someone who's uniquely qualified to help us navigate the challenges of living in the so-called age of information, or more accurately, the age of misinformation. With decades of experience as both a groundbreaking astrophysicist and a celebrated educator, he has dedicated his career to demystifying science and empowering people with the creative thinking tools we all need to make sense of an increasingly complex world.
So I'm David Helfand, about to begin my 48th year as a professor of astronomy at Columbia University in New York City. I've been president of the American Astronomical Society and am currently chair of the board of the American Institute of Physics. And I'm the author of a book, A Survival Guide to the Misinformation Age, which summarizes my concern for individual decision-making and public policy about misinformation and disinformation and how to counter it.
Dr. David J. Helfand is not just a distinguished professor of astronomy, but a leader in the global scientific community. He's dedicated his career to improving critical thinking and decision-making in the face of misinformation and disinformation. His ability to break down complex ideas into relatable insights makes him the perfect guide for our conversation today. So, settle in and join us as we hear from one of the top thinkers in science and critical reasoning, a conversation that just might change the way you approach the overwhelming flood of information we face every day. So, Professor David Helfand, thank you so much for making time for our show.
Entirely my pleasure.
I wanted to start off, like you talk about in the book, that we don't live in an information age so much as we live in a disinformation age. So maybe we can open there and you can tell us just a little bit about this landscape we're living in.
Yes, well, throughout most of human history, information has been limited, difficult to access, and expensive. So imagine the hunter-gatherer group of 20 or 30 related kin. They have a shaman. The shaman has figured out a lot of things, when the fruit's ripe, when the wildebeests migrate, etc. And the shaman's getting old, which probably then means 30 years old, and has to pass this on to the next generation. So it takes an entire year because he has to go through all the seasons. And the information is limited to what's stored in his head. He has to very expensively take that young hunter out of the hunting force and teach him all these things. And so that's very expensive. And it's difficult to access because there's no written record. Whereas today we live in the opposite situation where information is virtually unlimited, it's ubiquitous, and it's free. And while in the first instance, the information is very small in amount, but it's pretty well comporting well with reality because, after all, the person who gathers the poisonous berries ends up being eliminated from the gene pool, and the young hunter who leaves his kin to the hungry lions instead of the grazing gazelles also gets eliminated from the gene pool. But so the information is limited, but it's highly comporting with reality. Whereas today, that's no longer the case because you can broadcast information for free to tens or hundreds of millions of people, and you don't know these people, so you have no stake in their survival. And so anything you can say that can amass to you either fame or power or money, or if you're a politician, fame and power and money, is fair game. And as a consequence, our social networks are rife with misinformation, just things that are just plain wrong, and disinformation, things that are deliberately wrong and designed to focus people on policies and decision making, which is inimical to their health and survival.
Yeah. We're a show where we talk often about sort of toxic polarization and that kind of thing. And I don't know if this is an area you want to go in, but we're also, it seems like we're kind of living in a world where even the terms themselves, misinformation and disinformation, have sort of become defined in partisan ways as to who considers something misinformation and how people even use the term. I mean, for some people, these terms themselves has sort of become, I don't know, they see them as tools to suppress, valid or dissent, I should say. And, the act of fact checking they see as sort of a act of censorship. And I don't know if you can comment on that at all.
Yeah, well, the phrase that's most problematic these days is do your research, right? And what that means to a scientist, of course, is to follow a procedure where evidence is vetted at every step of the way against physical reality, and sources are checked and double checked deep into their origins of the statement that you have. Whereas what it means to most people is go on the web to all these websites that all say the same thing and reinforce your confirmation bias that your view is the view of the world that's correct because here's all these other people that believe it as well. So it's a really problematic situation and enabled by the free access of everyone to the web. There's a great statements about the democratization of information that the web provides. But my concern is, while it does do that, and I'm all in favor of that, and people in Sudan should have access to the electronics course at MIT, just like someone in Boston. Nonetheless, unfortunately, it's been used more to provide misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, and that kind of takes me to the demand side of this I wanted to talk about a little bit because, there's definitely demand out there. I mean, I'm sort of in this podcast world now, and you see the same kind of thing on YouTube and elsewhere. But, for every podcast trying to provide, quality information, there's just dozens and dozens offering kind of woo-woo nonsense sort of stuff, ghosts and UFOs and crystal healing and essential oils and anti-vax stuff and numerology and it all. And of course, then there's the sea of conspiracy theory stuff out there. So, what can you tell us about sort of the reasons behind this appeal? Because the demand is definitely there. And when there's demand, somebody's going to supply it in a free market.
That's right. There was a study a few years ago from MIT that showed that patently false information spreads 6 times faster on social networks than true information. And that's a consequence of the evolution of our brains, which has been going on for 300,000 years, 299,980 of which did not have the internet. And so our brains are wired to look for patterns to both find food and avoid ending up being food. And so we look for patterns and we find patterns. We're really good at finding patterns. There's even a word for it, apophenia, where you find correlations between things that really have no relationship to each other at all. There's a wonderful website, Tyler Vegan's website, I don't know if you know this, that he has hundreds and hundreds of extremely high correlations, like the number of associate degrees granted in music in the United States and the solar power generation of electricity in Costa Rica, right? They're 99% correlated over a 10 or 12-year period. And of course, they have nothing to do with each other because if you look at enough information, you can find things that correlate. But our brains are designed to do that. They really are wired to find correlations. And so people find these correlations and then they're off and running. Our brains are also designed to be alert to surprises, right? If you're out walking in the Serengeti and all of a sudden you see a tiger or lion or something, that you want to be alert to that and react quickly. And so our brains have these very fast circuits that react very quickly to surprises. And misinformation is often surprising because it's not what you necessarily knew. And so that makes it something you jump on, and you send it to all your friends, and they send it to all their friends, and that's why it spreads 6 times faster than real information. So it's a consequence of a brain wired over 300,000 years on the plains of the Serengeti, operating in a world that's saturated with electronic communication.
A lot of people say, it's because people are dumb and that's why they fall for these things. So, I mean, maybe, I don't know if you can comment on that. Like, do we have an IQ problem, or is this just basically a psychological problem, or is it just something else entirely?
No, as I say, I think it's this mismatch between what our brains are wired to do and the circumstances we find ourselves in. People aren't any dumber than they were 100,000 years ago, I don't think. But there's an issue of education, which, we don't do spectacularly well in this country, at least. And it's not what people often refer to as science literacy. It's really a literacy about scientific modes of thinking, or rational, one might say, modes of thinking. So I don't think it matters one in the slightest that the average citizen knows how a mitochondrion works in a cell, or why Uranus is the distance from the sun and how it takes as long as it takes to go around. Those are all a bunch of science facts they can find if they want them, but they're not very useful. What is useful is having a basic understanding of correlations versus causation, of basic probability to understand the likelihood of something happening rather than just using anecdotal data. The fact that measurements are often uncertain, and that's an inherent part of science, or an inherent part of life. And basic quantitative reasoning skills, that when you read an article in a paper or hear a politician make a statement that's wrong by a factor of 1,000 or a factor of 1,000,000, you go, that doesn't sound right. Those kinds of skills we're not teaching at all. And those are what are most essential for avoiding the misinformation, disinformation trap.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of my, I don't know if pet peeve's the right word, but it seems like nobody goes around and brags about being illiterate, right? Not very many people anyway. But people tend to almost brag about being, not having strong numeracy skills, and so it's like there's no social cost for it, and so you have a whole chapter in the book about climate change. And I think that's in there to sort of demonstrate scientific method and critical thinking. And, I guess one question I would have related to that is, can anybody do this? I mean, can just the average person who is not a science or math geek, or even these people with lower numeracy skills, can they do this, or does it require is there a bar?
Well, they certainly can do it. It depends what level you're starting at. As I like to say, all 5-year-olds are scientists because they're constantly exploring the world and doing experiments and are curious about things. And somehow our education system manages to beat that curiosity out of them. So by the time they come to college, they've decided they're innumerate and they're proud of it, as you say, or they're a science person or they're a non-science person. I refuse to allow students to say that in my classes. And so, yes, I have a highly selective group of students. And yes, I am convinced that all of them can learn it. But I think anyone can learn it. It's just a matter of being open to the idea that numbers matter and that these kinds of reasoning skills are distinct from the reliance on anecdote and random information that one can find so easily on the web.
Well, and one thing I've sort of learned from some of the expert guests that I've had on is it's not sort of an innate, natural thing for us. That this is actually a learned behavior, and so it takes effort. You have to learn it and practice it, and it and a lot of people. I often see people sort of confusing, I don't know, just contrarianism with critical thing. You talked about one of my favorite pet peeves, the do your own research thing. And I often see people confusing critical thinking with just, sort of rejecting everything outright. And just a sort of, and skepticism is part of it, but there's also evidence, it involves evidence. Like, talking about correlation is not causation. I mean, how you make it into finding the cause, right, is going and finding other evidence that would say, oh, okay, that correlation is meaningful. Isn't it something, and that's what we're kind of talking about a lot, right? Some of it is figuring out the evidence that's out there and how it applies to these other things you're observing, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the curiosity, I would argue, of a 5-year-old is innate in our brain structures. But this kind of reasoning is certainly not. And I don't know if you know Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast and thinking slow. We do have two kinds of circuits in our brains, and the thinking fast is the reason we're still here because we escaped all those lions. It's really important. And it's important when you're driving a car and doing other things like that. So it's not that that's a skill to be denigrated. But the thinking slow part is what makes us have the remarkable technological world that we have today. And that comes from the thinking slow part. And sometimes you just have to slow down. And so, yeah, this is not intuitive at all. It's something that has to be learned. But language is not intuitive either. We have to learn that. And we learn that by mimicking people around us. Unfortunately, we don't have the people around us to mimic the rational scientific reasoning skills as readily apparent every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm going to try to circle back to that as well a little bit more. But I do want to bring this up because I get it even from my listeners who, I think are mostly appreciate values of science and the science literacy, like you mentioned, but I guess, well, let me ask it this way. And would you agree that some alternative views stem from legitimate concerns about, sort of mainstream narratives? And if so, like, what's the importance of addressing those concerns rather than dismissing them outright?
Well, yeah, an important thing that it's very tricky for us to convey properly is that science is all contingent. Our ideas we have today on some things are radically different than they were 10 years ago or 50 years ago. Now, this is not to say that, as newspaper articles tend to, that every week there's a revolution in science and we throw out everything we knew before and start again. That constant so-called paradigm shifting is not the way science works. But science does evolve, and this gets back to the issue of uncertainty. Our measurements have uncertainty and our models have uncertainty. And a lot of what science is poking and probing and pushing and trying to find the errors and find the problems, find the places where the model doesn't match reality, and therefore refine it to match reality. So there's nothing, and skepticism, as you mentioned earlier, is a critical part of science. And it's not a negative connotation. Skepticism is good. But skepticism has to operate within a rational framework, not just be blanket skepticism that I don't believe anything, because that's a nihilistic point of view, which is not very helpful.
Right. Yeah. And, talking about good role models, I'm going to kind of go the other way for just 1 second and talk about some of the failures. And it seems like science communication is always a struggle, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it better. And there have been some failures. I mean, I would say that there was a lot of failures around how, COVID-19 pandemic information and how that got out. And maybe give us, you have any interesting examples of like where science communication has failed, to maybe engage or educate effectively, and most importantly, kind of what can we learn from it?
Well, it's when we don't engage. That's the exact word. If we just pontificate, and we can be very highly confident, for example, talking about climate change, that human emission of greenhouse gases is changing the geochemistry and the temperature of the planet. We're highly confident of that. But stating that and telling people, and so you have to install heat pumps and buy an electric car and not eat meat on Fridays or any time or something like that, that's completely unhelpful, because you're going from information to values. People can be receptive to information, but not when it conflicts with their values. And scientists are not trained, unfortunately, to be very good at communicating with people other than fellow scientists. And so you end up in this closeted little world, and you can talk to each other just fine and write papers full of jargon which your fellow scientists can understand, but there is no reward in the current system of academia or government, no reward for effective science communication. And that means starting to, as you say, engage, that is, understand the information basis and the value system of the person you're talking to. And if you don't understand that, or worse, if you just dismiss that, then you're clearly not going to be a very effective communicator.
Have you encountered any particular challenges in communicating some of your findings to non-experts?
Well, I give a lot of talks, a lot of public talks on climate change, and the title is What We Know and What We Don't Know. And so I talk about both, because there are things that we know with considerable confidence, and there are things that we don't know. And I'm always amused that not infrequently I get a response like, my sister-in-law went to your talk on climate change, and she said you said there was no such thing as climate change, and it was all natural cycles and all this other stuff. And I want to know how you get away from doing that, because you're not even a climate scientist, you're an astronomer. And I say, well, it's interesting. The other 400 people there certainly got the impression that climate change was real. It's because of the filters people put on, and confirmation bias allows them to interpret things that way. So as careful as I am, and every slide is labeled fact, or physics, or fiction, or, so you could see clear what it is. Even doing that, I still miscommunicate with some fraction of the audience who has an opposite opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, have you seen those values? I mean, that's an example, I suppose, of it. But I mean, and when you've had direct interactions, have you seen a way to incorporate and engage with those values?
I can't say I'm very successful there. One example is people of deeply religious faith. If the difference between faith and science is that science is rife with uncertainties and faith is rife with certainties. And people are more comfortable with certainties, even though that's not the way life is most of the time. And so that I haven't figured out yet, how to communicate across that barrier at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talked on this show a little bit about diversity in academia and in science, and there's certain disciplines that sort of just look at the numbers, you could sort of lean one way or the other pretty heavily, particularly like the social sciences are heavily populated with folks that lean left. I mean, have you... I guess the question is, I mean, what comments do you have about improving, trying to diversify academia more? And I know it's a lot self-selecting, and there's all these kind of factors into it. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, that's a difficult one. It's true. It's certainly true that whether it's in science or social science, and certainly in the humanities, most of academia leans heavily to the left. Now, but you have to ask, why is that? Now, it could just be that it's a big cabal and we exclude everyone else from the system. I don't believe that's the case. I can imagine it happens, but I don't believe that's the whole thing. Liberal comes from libre, which means free. And the liberal arts, which includes science, are the things pursued by free-thinking people. And free-thinking people are not bound by absolute ideas. They are free to explore. And so I think there is a selection effect, but it's a selection effect in what the purpose of a university is, that it selects people who want to explore ideas. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't mean you end up with an English department that's, exclusionary of right-wing thinking people, or a political science department for that matter. But I think there is a natural and, in my view, essential bias in academia for people who are open to all ideas, and that leads in our society, unfortunately, to a preference for the political left.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I want to talk about, I know that, this is a challenging topic and there's no quick answers, even though that's what we all want. But this, I've had many experts on the show that have sort of talked about how it's not even that we really live in a post-truth world so much as we live in a post-trust world. And, we've already talked a little bit about that demand side of misinformation. And a lot of that is driven by this trust problem or lack of trust. And, I find people that are essentially hostile to expertise and hostile to institutions. And yet they'll trust like the dude in the basement on a YouTube channel somewhere. And I even hear from, like I was mentioning before a little bit, I even hear from my listeners who are a little bit more, science curious and that kind of thing. And they have a lot of skepticism about trusting science and academia as well. And maybe you can talk about this a little bit. I mean, maybe you thought about some strategies to restore that trust.
Oh, that's a hard one. Yeah, the trust deficit is a very, 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 very serious problem. And again, it requires understanding the contingent nature of science and the fact that measurements are uncertain and the fact that models are there to be tested and probed and falsified and moved on from. I think the problem is this inherent uncertainty and contingent nature of science that is difficult to therefore put your trust in this. And the media problem of, this week it's coffee is going to extend your life by 10 years, and next week coffee is going to kill you. This kind of, and scientists are complicit in that. I mean, they publish a paper, they want to get media coverage for it, so their university will pat them on the head. And so they write press releases which exaggerate the effect. And then, as I say, scientists almost are never trained to communicate effectively with the public. And so they come across as the same as the dude in the basement in his YouTube channel, because they're just making absolute statements and you just have to believe me and go away if you don't. So it's a very difficult problem. Being an educator, of course, I have to say education is a solution to all these problems. And therefore, we need to take our K through 12 education system and, first of all, boost its level of respect in society, and attract to it some of the best students that come out of our universities and invest them with the idea that they should be educating students to think for themselves, to be skeptical, but to be careful of their sources and to learn to build trust in appropriate places. But I don't know how, and I don't know anybody who knows how to start from where we are now with scientists and have them reintegrate in a way that will generate trust.
It's like every scientist needs a PR team.
Or it needs to be a PR team on his or her own. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, you've been doing this for quite a while. You've been an educator for many decades. Give us some optimism about what you've seen in your students over the years and what you're seeing, right now.
Oh, well, let's see. I do generally convince students, not all of them, of course, but I largely teach classes for non-science majors. So I teach science classes for non-science majors. And I do generally convince students to drop this, I'm a science person, I'm not a science person. I spent 27 years developing this class at Columbia, which finally got approved 20 years ago, to teach a science class to all incoming students together. So that's the, National Physics Olympiad champion and the person who hasn't had a science course since 8th grade. And to get people to recognize that, first of all, you never know if you really understand something unless you can explain it to someone who doesn't understand it. And to take advantage of that distribution of backgrounds in classes, we teach this in small 20-student classes, to use their knowledge and figure out how to communicate it to people who don't know it. So peer learning it can be a very powerful thing. And so that works remarkably well. I mean, there was great resistance to it when we introduced it 20 years ago because, I'm not a science person. Don't put me in the science class. But at Columbia, we have this famous core curriculum, which up until that point consisted of 7 humanities courses, 0 math courses, 0 science courses, and 0 social science courses, which didn't strike me quite as the intellectual coat of arms we wanted to send our students off into the 21st century with. And so adding the science course has steadily increased in student appreciation over the years as we've done experiments, because we're scientists, so we do experiments, and learn how to do these things more effectively. And one of them is providing resources for students with weak backgrounds to educate themselves outside of class, and then in class to have the students work together so that this range of preparations can allow people to develop communication skills that generate the kind of trust that we hope all of our citizens will ultimately have.
Mm-hmm. That's all. Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that in itself seems like a example of that sort of pretty much anybody can do this. You don't have to plan on being a chemist or other kind of scientist to kind of gain from this.
That's right. But of course, so I'm doing this at Columbia. So that's important because these people are going to become CEOs and senators and stuff like that. But the point is, this is not being offered to the other 4 million students in the country at other universities, let alone people who aren't in universities in high school. And so that's the big problem as I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So I guess I'll wrap up with, any call to actions. Now, I mean, one of the disadvantages of, individually is you don't get that peer, you don't have that peer interaction to learn from, which from research I've seen is really, really powerful. But you can still do things. So what calls to actions would you have for listeners? I mean, first, buy your book, of course, but after that.
Sure, buy my book and read it. Read that. After that, read it.
Yeah, please read it.
I think what's most important, as I say, is to make sure that, again, not science literacy, but science reasoning literacy be integrated into our K through 12 education system. So get elected to a school board, support teachers who are doing this, and don't support legislatures who are instituting requirements to teach biblical scripture in science classes. This may be a place for biblical scripture in public schools. That's a controversial issue, but the place for it is certainly not in science classes. And so we have to distinguish that science isn't everything. Science is one way of addressing our place in the world and trying to make it a more predictable place so we can live more comfortable lives. And that's part of life. It's not all of life. So let's not let science become overweening in its impression of itself. Let's keep it in its lane, but make sure that we distinguish the kinds of reasoning skills that are necessary when we're thinking about problems that have to do with health and climate and other scientific topics.
And even taxes and things like that.
Even politics.
Even politics. Well, Professor Helfand, I'm tongue-tied. I'm so amazed that you were able to make time for us. Tell us the name of the book one more time.
The book is A Survival Guide to the Misinformation Age, and you can find it in your local bookstore, or if you have to, on Amazon.
Yeah. Or even your library, perhaps.
Even your library.
That's great. No, I mean, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for making time for us again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good luck with your enterprise. It's very important.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.